I want to thank Abhirani and Neil Vora and Mark Speakman for the pleasure of coming to speak with you all today. As Anil mentioned, I'm a urologist by training, got involved with laparoscopic prostatectomy back in 2000, spent some time with Guy in Valencia and over in Paris. In 2004, transitioned over to robotic prostatectomy and spent the next 6 years doing about 500 robotic prostatectomies per year. After about 3,000 robotic prostatectomies, I decided that I needed more, not more surgeries, but felt like I wanted to do more in medicine than just these procedures. I had an opportunity and took a part-time position while I still did some surgeries with Intuitive Surgical as their senior medical advisor, focused not on surgeons or surgeries or even new products. It was really on how do we help hospitals to move from owning equipment to having a program around robotic-assisted surgery, and that evolved into us needing to better understand how the economics work, not just in the US, but in countries around the world for robotic-assisted surgery. We then formed a small division of Intuitive Surgical dedicated to the healthcare economics around robotics. In 2011, quit my job completely as a surgeon, completely disrupted my family, freaked out my wife and my kids and my parents, and decided that I was going to stop doing surgeries altogether and take a job really looking at robotic-assisted surgery from the corporate level. I took a job with HCA, and I spent the last 3.5 years building what is now the world's largest database for robotic-assisted surgery. We have over 500 billion with a B data points on over 150,000 procedures across continents, both the UK and the US, where HCA has hospitals and robots. The HCA is the largest owner of robotic-assisted devices in the world, over $250 million in devices, and we are the largest consumer of robotic products in the world, with over 37,000 procedures alone being done in 2015. I mention this to you because my vantage point on robotic-assisted surgery and the economics of it are a little bit unusual in that although I'm a surgeon and I've seen robotics through the eyes of a surgeon, I've also lived on the side of industry as well as on the side of hospital management, not just at the hospital level, but as the vice president of robotics for all of HCA, over 106 of our facilities, 156 robots across 2 continents. And that provides me with a unique vantage point on how robotics is seen by a number of individuals. And I'll tell you, I've listened to a lot of talks and read a lot of papers and been an editor in a lot of our journals, and I'll tell you that the data behind the economics of robotic-assisted surgery in all of these papers and all these presentations are correct, but the math is often wrong. So I want to walk you through how you should be looking at robotic-assisted surgery, what accountants and what hospitals do when they look at any piece of equipment. So a couple basic facts. Is the robot expensive? Yes, it's very expensive, like £2 million sort of expensive. This is the single most expensive piece of capital equipment your hospital will purchase for your operating rooms in the history of your operating rooms. Do the instruments cost more? Absolutely. It is few and far between that even in a highly efficient operating room, one that is very, very lean Six Sigma, that you can actually have instruments for your robotic cases that are less expensive than the comparable instruments for the open cases or the laparoscopic equivalents. Do the procedures take longer? Most often they do. Outside of a few rock star surgeons that do a huge volume of these procedures, most surgeons doing robotics take a little bit longer doing these procedures than they would do them open or laparoscopically. So given that the robot is very expensive, that the instruments cost more, that the procedures take longer, is doing a procedure robotically more expensive than the open or laparoscopic equivalent? And the answer is not necessarily. How is that even humanly possible? How does the math work on that? What color is the sky in my world if that actually makes sense? If you own a robot, it's similar to owning a car and a house. If you were fortunate enough to just pay cash, no loans, no mortgages, you just bought your car and bought your house outright with no debt at all associated with it. The costs of owning your car are costs of consumption. The more you drive it, the more gas you consume, the more the wheels on the tire rotate around, the more you go through rubber on your tires, the more you go through your brakes. It's consumption costs. If you bought a car and you stuck it in your garage for the next 3 months and did nothing with it, it would cost you nothing because it's just sitting there. Cars are consumption costs. Your house is different. Your house is an ownership cost. I'm here in the UK. I live in Austin, Texas. My house does not cost me less because I happen to be here in the UK. Nor is on a day when I get home at 3 o'clock because I had some parent-teacher conference with my kids that I went to, or if I stayed late because I had meetings and got home at 10 p.m., it did not cost me more or less to live in my house because I spent more or less time in my house. Your house is an ownership cost. Now, understand that as I exist, my cost of living in my home and driving my car and doing my work is both of these. But as we think about robotic-assisted surgery, it's like owning a car and owning a house. Your procedure costs are consumption costs. In the world of accounting, these are called variable expenses, meaning they vary based on use. In fact, even more specifically, they're variable direct expenses because they are variable and directly involved with the clinical care of patients. Your program costs include your ownership cost, meaning at the end of the year, if you want to see if you've made or lost money, if it was more or less expensive than if you had never bought this robot in the first place, that is when you add in the cost of your robot. But because the robot cost and the maintenance cost does not go up or down based on how often you use the robot, it's not a variable expense, which means it's not a part of your procedure costs, but it is a part of your programmatic costs. So what does this look like? I'm running through a couple examples. We're starting to do a lot more colon and rectal surgery across HCA hospitals, both in the US and starting to think about doing it here in the UK. And we have roughly 257 data points on cost from when the patient enters the hospital to when they leave the hospital. And I don't mean enters the operating room, I mean enters the hospital to when they leave the hospital. And those 247 data points get broken down to about 47 buckets. And if we look at them and compare them from open to minimally invasive, open to robotic, what we find is the med-surg supplies and devices are more expensive because, as I mentioned, the supplies are more expensive. The pharmacy costs, however, are less because as we transition from open to minimally invasive surgery, these patients don't require PCA pumps, they don't need epidurals, they don't need antibiotics for as long, they consume less pharmaceuticals. They also spend less time in the ICU, specific 2.7 days less in the ICU for our colorectal procedure for the last 5 years. They spend a little bit longer in the operating room, so our services are longer. At the end of it all, when we look at robotic-assisted surgery relative to open surgery for colon and rectal procedures, and specifically we're looking at right hemicolectomies and sigmoidectomies, those are the highest volume of procedures that we're doing robotically and open, it's $4,000 less. We have a $4,000 net to the good to do these procedures robotically, mostly because of a 2.7 day shorter stay in the ICU, 5 days less on the floor, and a significant reduction in the amount of pharmaceuticals utilized. So what about our program costs? How does this all work out? Well, if we want to look at a program cost, we have to look at our total consumption cost, which is all that we've consumed over the course of the year. We then add in the ownership cost. In the US, we have about a $2.1 million robot, and the way that we do accounting is we amortize that. We don't assign $2.1 million to the accounting platform for 1 year. We divide it over a number of years, and for robots, it's typically a 7-year amortization schedule. So we assign $310,000 worth of cost per year to the robot. We then have about a $150,000 maintenance contract associated with the robot, and if we add that together, we're at about $460,000 per year of ownership cost that we would not have had we never bought the robot in the first place. Now, for our colon and rectal procedures, if our colon and rectal surgeons came to us and said, hey, we believe that we can actually do about 115, or roughly two per week, colon and rectal procedures in the coming year. Well, at 2 per week, or 115 procedures, at a $4,000 cost savings, we're at negative $460,000. So if our robotic platform was based solely on colon and rectal surgery and HCA, we would be at a net zero. Meaning we would not have made or lost any more money. This is not profitability. This is just, is it more or less expensive? We would be dead even with open surgery if we did 115 colon and rectal procedures per year based off of the patient's hospitalization, mostly reduction in ICU days, length of stay, and pharmaceutical use. So why can't I just take this $460,000 and divide it by the procedures? Why do I have to do it at the end of the year? Why can't I assign that cost per procedure like you see in many papers and many presentations? Let's say that we did 20 cases last year, because the way that it works when you assign a cost is you pick a number. You pick a number. Let's say we did 20 procedures last year in colon and rectal, and I'm deciding as a hospital administrator whether or not I should allow my colon and rectal surgeons to go ahead and do the 115 procedures they would like to next year. I take my $460,000 divided by 20, I end up with an extra $23,000 of additional cost per case. Now I know that it's going to save me $4,000 per case, so it's only $19,000 more per case. If they tell me they're going to do 115 procedures, that means that I'm looking at an extra $2.185 million in additional cost. If it's not clinically better, you're not doing it. But that's not true. I just showed you that that math isn't true, because $4,000 times 115 is $460,000. You're at dead even. Why is this not working? It's because of parentheses. My son, Trevor, is 15 years old. My daughter, Sophie, is 12. In my daughter's math class this year, they talked about the order of operations. This is just the universal laws of math, the way math works. This is the pretty please, my dear Aunt Sally. You do powers, then parentheses, then multiplication, then division, then addition, then subtraction. It's just the order of operations. It's the way you have to do math. It's the way it works. It's why 4 plus 3 times 2 is different than 4 plus 3 times 2. When we look at the cost of a procedure, that procedure lives within the parentheses because it's a variable expense. Those costs don't go up or down based off of how often you use the robot or not. The fixed cost of owning the robot is a fixed cost. It lives outside the parentheses. So our consumption cost variance, how much more or less it cost us, times our procedure volume, that's the variance in procedure cost. That's did it cost me more or less. If I want to look at the program cost variance, if I want to add in the cost of the robot, I have to do that outside the parentheses because that is an indirect expense. That is a fixed expense. That is something that does not go up or down with the procedures that we use. Variable expenses live inside the parentheses, not fixed. If you talk to any accountant on any continent, you start with your net revenue. You subtract out your variable costs. That gives you your contribution margin. From that, you subtract out your indirect and your fixed costs. And eventually, you get down to your EBITDA, which is your earnings before interest, taxes, amortization. You don't get to amortization and costs of fixed equipment until you're way, way down the ledger sheet. We can't add those things into a procedure. The math just doesn't work. And again, I'm not talking about profitability. That takes into account revenue. And whether you're on a national health system or you have privately insured, that's not the equation we're talking about. We're just talking about more or less expensive than the open or laparoscopic equivalents and how we do the math. So how does it work out for a lot of procedures that we do? So we looked at procedures across all of HCA over the last since 2004, so 11 years that we've been doing robotic-assisted surgery, actually 12. Our first one was in 2003. For radical prostatectomy, we spend a little bit more time in the operating room, so that's more expensive. The med-surg supplies are a little more expensive. Room and board is less because the patients go home a little sooner. At the end of the day, we're about $900 more to do a procedure robotically than to do it open for radical prostatectomy. How about partial nephrectomy? Our OR service is a little bit higher because we're a little longer in the operating room. Med-surg supplies a little bit higher. Our pharmacy costs are lower because the patients go home sooner. Our ICU stay is shorter. We are $806 less to do a partial nephrectomy robotically versus open when you look at from the moment the patient arrives in the hospital to when they leave. We just take all, this is just the math, people. This is just take every single expense and add it up. That's it. If we look at a lot of procedures that we do, some of the highest volume ones, benign hysterectomy, 5 cents. And we actually compared this to laparoscopic. We didn't compare this to open because laparoscopic in the US is our standard of care for benign hysterectomy. So we're 5 cents, that's just what it is, cheaper for a benign hysterectomy, and we're about $1,200 less expensive for radical hysterectomy. Again, similar to colorectal surgery because of the shorter ICU stay, shorter length of stay, less use of pharmaceuticals. So when we're looking at the cost of robotic-assisted surgery, your cost of a procedure is the cost of what you consume. If you want to look at the cost of all your procedures, it's the cost of everything you consume. If you want to look at what your program costs, like should I or should I have not bought this robot, at the end of the year, you can take all of your consumption costs, and those are it for us. You can then add in your ownership costs and figure out if your cost is above or below that of what you would have done otherwise with open or laparoscopic surgery. So at some point in time, if your consumption savings for procedures, moving from open to minimally invasive, if the ICU stay, if the length of stay, if the pharmaceutical use, if all of those things create a consumption variance to the good for robotics, at some point in time that consumption variance times the number of procedures will be greater than your ownership cost. And when that happens, then you're actually doing a higher quality of care at a lower cost. Thank you for your time and patience today.
Thank you.